I think it's 9:30 here, 9:30 p.m. here in China, and very early morning in Chicago. So let's start our event. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. This is the Transnational and Situated Seminar Series hosted at Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Humanities. And my name is Flair Donglai, and I'm the host of this series. And today I'm very excited that we have Professor Haun Saussy of University of Chicago as our main speaker. Professor Saussy is a renowned sinologist and university professor at the University of Chicago, teaching in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations and in a committee on social thought. He is a fellow of the American Academy in Berlin and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His work attempts to bring the lessons of classical and modern rhetoric to bear on several periods, languages, disciplines, and cultures. Among his numerous books are The Problem of the Chinese Aesthetic, Great Walls of Discourse, The Ethnography of Rhythm, Translation as Citation, Are We Comparing Yet? The Making of Barbarians, that's the latest one in English, I guess. The Making of Barbarians, Chinese Literature in Multilingual Asia, just published last year. And in Chinese, there is a new essay collection just published this year called 如之和. I noticed there is no Chinese, no English title for this book yet. I guess it might be very difficult to translate 如之和.
Well, so my own translation for that is comparatively speaking.
That is wonderful. Yes, I think they should put it on the book cover. It will be very interesting. Yes, so it's published by Nanjing University Press just this year. He was also a Guggenheim Fellow and served as the president of the American Comparative Literature Association. I met Professor Saussy almost like 10 years ago when I was just embarking on my journey as a comparative literature major in London in 2014 when he came to London to do a talk. And I remember the topic was something related to Confucianism and classical Chinese poetry in intercultural encounters between East and West. And that was my first serious contact with the discipline of sinology in a way. And he introduced me to the work of many Chinese comparative literature scholars working in that field, like Zhang Longxi. And I greatly appreciated that. It really opened up new horizons for me. And I have been following his work closely ever since. And this term, I'm teaching at Shanghai Jiao Tong University in the MA in Modern Chinese Studies program. And we have this compulsory course originally called Sinology or 中国学 or China Studies, just very simple. But since I came to it, I thought I would add a little prefix to it. I now changed it to a critical introduction to sinology and China studies because I find the terms like 汉学, 国学, 中国学, these terms are very difficult to conflate and translate in a way, right? And I also feel like I've been trained, because I've been trained in post-colonial studies, there is always this difficulty I found in balancing my sense of awe for the historical tradition of sinology as a field, but also my cynicism for some of the Orientalist aspects of the field. And also there's this latest debate about the concept of sinologism a lot of scholars are involved in. So I, when I came to this course and I was thinking about the lineup of speakers for the series for this term, I immediately thought of Professor Saussy, and I'm really curious what he would say about this whole debate and his reflections on sinology and East-West encounters as a devoted sinologist involving in the frontiers of the research in this field in the age of globalization, right? So I'm really grateful that he agreed to do this talk for us. And the title of his talk today is Mingled Identities and Lives in Translation, China as a Calling from Matteo Ricci onwards. So before we start the talk, just some housekeeping rules. So as per usual for this series, there's no strict time limit for the speaker. So Professor Saussy can talk as long as he wants. And when he finishes, we will move on to the Q&A session with me and the online audiences. You can type your question in the chat box first, and then I will unmute you so that you can ask it for yourself. Before you ask your questions, please identify yourself by introducing your name, your affiliation, or maybe your major. And please be aware that the entire event is being recorded and will probably be uploaded online later. So yes, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Saussy to deliver this wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll set my timer for 45 minutes, which I think is probably long enough for a talk, and try to keep my remarks within that space. That way, I hope we'll have plenty of time for questions and conversation. So I'm very happy to be addressing the Transnational and Situated Forum because to say transnational and situated immediately evokes the question of point of view, right? A situated scholarship is one that acknowledges its point of view and doesn't present itself as being, simply the objective truth about things. And transnational, of course, involves you in the space between nations, which means always a space where there is some competition and conflict of power and loyalty and legitimacy and so on. I'm very interested in both those dimensions because in a way they are inseparable from the practice of China studies as I understand it. I want to comment on a couple of points in the title that I gave earlier. When I said from Matteo Ricci onwards, I'm afraid that was too ambitious. I should really have said, 以利玛窦为例, using Matteo Ricci as one example of a kind of a tendency, because there's simply not time and space to narrate the whole story of China studies from 500 years ago to the present. Second thing I want to mention is China as a calling. I want to insist on that word, right? Because in one sense of the term, right, a calling is a 职业, right? It's something that you do, like a job. It's a professional identity that China scholars take on. But the somewhat archaic meaning, which is tied up with ideas of religious vocation or of one's life purpose, makes calling a somewhat more serious term. And you might even think in a sort of a Heideggerian sense of a call that comes to you from somewhere, right? A voice from the beyond that says, here it is. This is China. This is interesting. This is important for your life. So much more than 职业 then. It's really about a kind of vocation. All right. So anyway, that by way of preface. I've been interested and maybe a little bit dismayed by the meanings that have attached to the word sinology over the 40 or so years that I've been engaged in China studies. The word simply, logically, it simply means the study of things of China, and therefore anybody who is studying things from China could be considered a sinologist in terms of the simple etymological meaning of the word. But it's taken on the connotation of the study of China done by people who are not Chinese. Right?
Yes, Professor Saussy, sorry, I think you need to share your PPT first.
I will in a moment, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm still, don't worry, I'll do that when I get to it. But anyway, it's come to mean the study of China by people who are not Chinese. So that implies a kind of a model taken from Edward Said, right, in which knowledge is power. Therefore, wanting to gain knowledge means wanting power. And usually this is meant as wanting power on behalf of the colonial nation state. And that, I think, is not really accurate as a description of the people who are drawn into the study of China, right? Many of them are people who are by no means affiliated with colonial projects. They're anti-colonial in the majority. They have their doubts and questions about this and that, just as they do about their home cultures. And the worry that, of course, I think sinology should always be self-critical and ask itself the questions of whether or not it's serving some selfish purpose on the behalf of a nation state. But the idea that reducing people to their nationalities is inherently meaningful, I think is one that we have to reject. And there's also a kind of an anti-intellectual vein in the idea that gathering knowledge about foreign countries is in some way suspicious, right? So there's anti-intellectualism and essentialism as two threads in the way that Said's very otherwise quite justified critique is often deployed. So essentialism, anyway, is for me the thing that I'm always trying to debate against. What I am interested in is hybridity. People who are on the borders of institutions, nations, belief systems, languages, and so on, right? Who are resisting the simple identification with those categories. And today, what I want to investigate is life in translation, that is, translation as a form of life. And I'm taking that phrase from Wittgenstein, who, as you know, he begins his career as a philosopher by trying to fix the meaning of terms and inserting them in logical structures from which you can derive truth. And as he goes on, he begins to notice that what's important about words is not their meanings, but the way they're used. And in the later works of Wittgenstein, he talks a lot about languages as being part of a form of life. For example, I don't know, just come up with a random example. If you use the term the unconscious, you are therefore participating in a form of life that you share with other people who find Freudian theory important for their explanation of their world, right? So thinking of translation as a form of life is what I want to do today together with you. And that's what draws my interest in the Jesuits in China. Right? I'm not particularly attached to the missionary project or to Catholic doctrine. These are merely examples, but they're an example of something rather important. Let me try to share the screen, and then you'll see what I'm talking about, I hope. Here we go. Dong. All right. Is it showing? Yeah? The screen is showing? All right. I'm going to assume it is. All right. On we go. So, all right, there's the point about the meaning of the term sinology and the way it's used at present. So here's some of the things that I want us to have in mind. Bilingualism. I think everyone present at this talk today is to some degree bilingual, right? We are functioning here in English to talk about Chinese matters. People who are bilinguals, they have more than one system going in their minds as they talk about the world. And as you know, often you have a word for something in one language that you speak, and you don't quite have that word in the other language that you speak. This is a very interesting situation where perhaps you can talk about that situation only with other bilinguals who share the same two languages that you have. One thing that people do when they're bilinguals is they code switch, right? You've probably done it 20 times since you woke up this morning. You're talking to someone in one language, and then some reason comes up where it's useful to switch into another language. Let it be, Spanish or Japanese or Latin or whatever. There's a reason for switching from one code to the other. There's also ambiguity in the space between languages, right? If, I don't know, I'm going to make up an example, but if I'm speaking Chinese with someone and I want to talk about, say, social relations, if I use 社交, that's obviously a term that has a meaning in Chinese, but perhaps I'm applying it to a context of American English in which the sense of the words would be slightly different if we were speaking English. The fact that both Chinese and English are sort of in the air between us means that the meanings can be a little bit ambiguous between the two contexts. I'll come up on a very big case of ambiguity shortly. Translation sometimes can be very imperfect, right? I call this halfway translation. When you're expressing something that doesn't quite fit in the language you're using, but you can kind of gesture at the meaning that you have in mind. We have hybrid languages and hybrid systems. I think all of our languages are heavily hybridized. I remember once when I was in San Francisco on the bus, hearing two people who didn't look Chinese discussing in English a problem that involved their qi, right? So these are people who practice some form of traditional Chinese medicine and for whom the concept of qi has become familiar. It makes sense. Is qi an English word? Yes or no? Well, maybe it's not a question of yes or no, because if you keep using qi in English, and if you have a community of people who know what qi means, then it has become part of English, right? As English hybridizes. As Lu Xun said, all right, 路是人走出来的, and the use of non-English words in English or non-Chinese words in Chinese is an example of how usage can create hybridity. Anyway, these are the things that I want to talk about today in the context of 17th century translation, but always with an implication for the present. As we think about translation and culture, I also want to insist that there's a temptation to talk about identity. There's a temptation to talk about relation and to think of these as two polar ways of talking about say, hybridity. But I want to insist that it's not really a polar pair, right? It's not that if you have more identity, you have less relation, or the other way around. In fact, it's kind of a spectrum, right? There are various degrees of loading our terms with implications related to identity or implications related to relation. This sounds a little abstract, but I think you'll see what I mean as we get on with the discussion of translation, which translation, of course, is one form of life that involves identity and relation and complicates both of them. So, Matteo Ricci, for example, of European sinology, not necessarily of world sinology, but he's a good example. He's the person who came to China, was extremely intelligent, also extremely ambitious in the way that he addressed his Chinese contemporaries and tried to participate in Chinese life from his arrival in China in 1582 until his death in 1609. So we can see him as the proto-sinologist for that particular public. Let me insist parenthetically that there were lots of other people who were not part of China, but were gathering knowledge about China. People in Japan, people in Tibet, people in India, later on, people in Africa, people in South America, all kinds of places. And all those publics had their own versions of sinology, which had sometimes something to do with the European form, sometimes not much to do with the European form. We can't identify China study as being just the European variant, although the European variant is very loud and attention-getting. So I want to limit my implication here when I'm using Matteo Ricci as an example. He's not the example, but he's a good example to think with. So, all right, so Matteo Ricci was acquiring knowledge about China. He was translating what he knew into European languages, primarily Italian and Latin, and the messages that he sent back to Rome were quickly translated into French, German, Dutch, English, other languages, and circulated all around Europe, became part of the body of knowledge that Europeans could have about China without going to China. Ricci was also transmitting knowledge about Europe to China, right? And he was doing that with a certain agenda, with a filter, right? He was, let me be frank, he was not always terribly truthful. He was presenting a strategic image of China, of Europe to China, just as he was presenting a strategic image of China to Europe because of his particular missionary agenda. In any case, the knowledge about China that Ricci transmitted to Europe transformed what could be known and thought about Europe's own beliefs and history. That's something I want to emphasize, right? It's not simply that China knowledge is kept in a separate compartment for China scholars only, but thinking about China, reading about China, discovering Chinese philosophy, Chinese religion, Chinese political organization, as well as Chinese techniques of various kinds, these changed the way people thought about their own cultures. And something like that is what I mean by life in translation. You can be affected by the translation dynamic without necessarily being a translator or a bilingual person yourself. On the personal level, when you learn a new language, you have to learn a new way of being yourself in that language. I think that's something that we all experience, right? And it's a curious thing because the you that speaks that other language is different from the previous you, right? Maybe you become a better person in that other language. Maybe you're more complex. Most likely, much of the time, you're frustrated by the fact that you don't have the same words and references, and therefore you can't fully be the self that you used to be in your home language, but you're becoming somebody new, right? That's another case, I would say, of this ambiguity, the imperfect translation, the hybridity that goes together with the situation of translation. And by the way, I would add parenthetically that I really ought to speak Italian all the time because I'm a much nicer and more cheerful person when I speak Italian. Let's go on to a concrete example. This is probably not very readable on your screens, and I apologize for that. I'll explain. This is an excerpt from Matteo Ricci's report home, the reports that he wrote about his progress as a missionary and sent back to Rome to his superiors in the Jesuit order. And these were collected in the 1940s by an Italian priest named Venturitacchi, and then published as several very thick volumes with useful annotations. It's a fabulous primary source. This is Matteo Ricci writing about what he's seeing and thinking about and analyzing in his daily life in China, and also strategizing out loud about how he's going to change China. Let's see. Let's go to a section that I translate out of the page that I was just showing you of Ricci. So in this passage, he's explaining the different belief systems in China. He says, oh yeah, there is, you've got different sects in China, different religions. You've got what he calls the scholars, right? The religion of the scholars. These would be the Rujia, right? The Confucians. The idolaters, the followers of idols, of images. These would be the Buddhists. And then there are the magicians, the Taoists. And he has a few paragraphs on each one. He's not really very interested in the magicians. He thinks that their job is just to like sacrifice to bring the rain and things like that. He's somewhat interested in the Buddhists because he's competing with them, and he thinks they're the people who are far too influential in China, and they're wrong about essential things. So his agenda will be to displace the Buddhists. And the scholars are the people that he is most intimately connected with. Here, a little note, you probably already know this, that when Ricci first arrived in China, he saw that there were some people who were divided into male and female groups. They didn't marry. They had a special diet. They went around living on charity. They devoted themselves to religion. In other words, they were very much like Catholic priests. And these people were the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist clergy. So at first, he dressed like a Buddhist monk, and he engaged many of them in conversation and debate. That's how he was going to present himself in China. In other words, that's who he would be in translation, was a monk from the West. But as time went on, he discovered that the people that he really wanted to convert, the Chinese elite, didn't respect the monks very much. In fact, thought that monks were kind of the scourings of society, people not from very respectable or educated families who went into this and often could not be trusted. So he underwent an internal conversion while in China. He bought himself the silk robes of a mandarin, or of a dushuren anyway, and went out on the street and presenting himself as a rujia, right? So sort of the conversion of Matteo Ricci, we could call this. That would be nicely provocative, since mostly we read about Matteo Ricci trying to convert other people, all right? But this is how he was converted into a different identity in China. So he's going to be closely involved with the Zhu, but he's going to have some ideas that are a bit different from theirs. But a close engagement with the Zhu, more distant engagement with the Daoshi and the Foxuejia. So coming back to the quotation then, he says, so he's just describing Chinese cosmology, right? What do the Chinese generally believe in the world? And he says, the opinion that is most popular at present, it seems to me, was taken about 50 years ago from the sect of the idols, that is the Buddhists, and holds that this entire world is composed of a single substance, and that the creator of this world, as well as heaven and earth, humans and animals, trees and plants, and the four elements, all make up one continuous body, and all are members of this body. And from this unity of substance, the Chinese derive the charity that we must have towards one another, on the basis of which all men can become similar to God, inasmuch as they are of one and the same substance with him. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? This we intend to refute, not only with arguments, but also with the authority of their ancients, who clearly taught a rather different doctrine. Okay, so yeah, this is Ricci describing Chinese beliefs to people who are not Chinese and don't speak Chinese. And a couple of things that I want to call your attention to. It's a passage that has a lot of translational hybridity, right? The hybridity that is natural to translation. For example, the word substance, right? Single substance. If you were writing in 17th century Chinese, what word would correspond to substance? I mean, you might be able to come up with a term, but it wouldn't have all of the same philosophical meanings and implications. Substance, then, is a word that he's taking out of the Greek and Roman philosophical tradition and the Arabic philosophical tradition, in fact, and applying it to a philosophical language that doesn't really contain a word that corresponds to that. Further down, the four elements, well, as you know, four elements is a very European or Greek way of talking about nature, right? Anybody with any sense knows that there are 5 elements, and they're not really elements, but phases and so on, right? So he's adjusting his language to the people he's addressing, right? His fellow Europeans. And also charity, right? This is a very interesting point, because the word charity is a tremendously Christian term, right? Caritas in Latin, charis in Greek. It becomes prominent in the writings of St. Paul. Greek philosophy didn't really talk about charity previously. I mean, there were ways of being well disposed toward other people and generous and so on, but the specific concept of charity is really of Christian origin, but he's using it in a Chinese context to describe a conclusion that Chinese thinkers have arrived at. So that's interesting too, right? There's some hybridity and ambiguity, right? Clearly he's translating the term ren, right? But is charity the same thing as ren? Well, people have been arguing about that for 500 years. And Matteo Ricci is kind of staking out territory here. All right, so anyway, so he paraphrases a certain set of beliefs, and then he says, I've got arguments against this belief. And furthermore, I've been reading ancient Chinese philosophy, and it's different from this. This set of beliefs that is popular right now in 1600 emerged only about 50 years ago. Now, if you go to this edition, there are some helpful footnotes that are made by the annotator, but they often go sort of wide of the mark. Here, there's a lot of, in the footnotes, there's a lot of talk about Zhuxi. And okay, Zhuxi is sort of involved in this, but this specific sentence in Ricci, I think, is very clearly a paraphrase of something that we are familiar with from Wang Yangming, right? Just to keep in mind the version that Ricci was writing in speaking to Europeans, and have a look at this. This is, I forget which disciple of Yangming is writing this down, but anyway, he's writing down kind of the oral comments of Yangming, Wang Shouren. 大人者，以天地万物为一体者也。其视天下有一家，中国有一人焉。若复闻形体而分而我者，小人矣。大人之能以天地万物为一体也，非义之也。其心之人本若是。其与天地万物而为一也。其为大人，虽小人之心，亦莫不然，彼故自小之耳。All right, so here you have the content that Ricci was conveying, right? That everything in the world is one substance, and we owe it to one another, to even the lowliest among us, to have ren towards them, to see our identity with them. And there's even a hint of how Wang Yangming, if he were alive, would answer Ricci, because he would say, Ricci, you're trying to make yourself and the God you worship separate from the world. That is what the Xiaoren would do. And we don't want to be the Xiaoren, we want to be the Daren. And the list of things that are part of the world and toward which we have to have charity, we find that also in Yangming, right? 草木有生益者也，见瓦石之隐怀，而必有故喜之心焉。视其人之于瓦石而为一体也， right? So even bricks and tiles, if we see them destroyed, we should feel some concern, because if we're going to be Daren, we are in some way responsible for everything. even the 草木 and the 瓦石, right? That is the index of our being, 大人 and not 小人. Okay, so a very powerful ethical vision. And Ricci is suspicious of it, maybe because it's so persuasive, right? Because I personally find this extremely beautiful, extremely convincing as an ethical guideline. And maybe Ricci, when he comes into contact with people of the Yangming school, he feels a little bit threatened by the beauty and elegance and comprehensiveness of this ethical vision. So that's why it's very important to him to be able to refute this argument, both by saying, number one, it's not true because we have a different cosmology that is better. And number two, because this is really something that Yangming invented and he took it from the Buddhists. Right? So the two arguments, of course, are separate, but both will be useful for Ricci. But now, in this sort of dialogue between Wang Yangming and Matteo Ricci, Ricci is making himself into Wang Yangming's interlocutor. He's choosing to participate in a particular conversation, and it's just one among the millions of conversations that were taking place in Ming Dynasty China, and he wants to influence that conversation in a particular way. Right? This is all stuff that he could never have done if he had stayed in Europe. That would be outside the realm of possibilities. So by coming to China and by engaging with the Yangming Pai, he's becoming a different person. And in fact, speaking biographically, Ricci was in conversation with Li Zhi, who represented one particular position among the followers of Yangming. Now, if he had been successful, Ricci would have changed the way Chinese people think about their own tradition and made it more hospitable to the teachings he was bringing in from outside. Right? So again, conversation is not simply adding a layer of commentary to something that exists and won't be changed, but the conversation changes the subject of conversation. What happened, though, was actually something of the inverse. I don't think Ricci had that much effect on Chinese thought. The thinking of Spinoza, however, many people have traced back to Ricci's reports, right? Spinoza with his idea that God and the universe are more or less the same thing, and that we have to think about them in the same terms. This dangerous idea, many people have traced back to the importation of Chinese thought by the missionaries, even though the missionaries represented Chinese thought only in order to refute it. So there was a kind of an unexpected consequence of that conversation. So that the argument about Spinoza, maybe it's a little bit shaky, but the representation of Chinese thought is certainly coming at the right moment in European history, where a lot of people will be ready to hear what it has to say and will nativize it, right? Will make it part of their own tradition in their own ways. In any case, Ricci was able to frame the belief system of Ming Dynasty followers of Wang Yangming in a plausible way, even though he rejected it. Right? So that's the work of the translator. Right? There's a moment in translating where you simply have to be fair to the thing that you're talking about. You have to show the content as it is, and then you put your spin on it. So I want to go back to here. Let's stay with Ricci for a moment. So I want to emphasize again the idea that by doing the kind of work he's doing as a missionary, Ricci is not just going in one direction, right? It's not a simple linear transfer of Catholic belief into the Chinese language made to happen by the missionary, but rather the missionary is participating in a form of life that I'm calling translation, which is not the same as life without translation or before translation, right? Many people think of Ricci only as a person who translated a content from A to B. I think of him as a person who lived in the channel or the medium that he was creating between A and B, a channel that changed both A and B. If you think about translation as a linear transfer, then we tend to assume that we know what A and B are, right? We know what Catholic doctrine is, we know what Chinese philosophy is. We think of them as stable, coherent, and unchanging bodies of knowledge. Well, I say, no. What's really happening is that the process of translation lets these two bodies of knowledge affect one another and reveals some of the internal diversity of each. That's what must have happened in Ricci's mind, and it certainly happens in this little passage where he's translating and debating with Wang Yangming. Even though it's a very short passage, I think it's very rich in implications. Now, Ricci's conversion strategy, as you know, was highly, here I'm going to jump a little bit, hold on, yeah, was highly ambiguous. It relied on certain ambiguities, certain terms that would be acceptable to his colleagues in Rome and also to his colleagues in China, his friends among Chinese literati. Most obviously the term Tian, right? Where they could all sit around talking about Tian, and inside their heads, they might have very different representations of what Tian meant, but they could come up with sentences that both agreed were true about Tian, right? If you really got down to it, you might find that they were talking about different things, right? I mean, this often happens in law and diplomacy and other, fairly important domains of language use, right? Where we cover over deep disagreements by using words in this ambiguous way. But let's take a look at a near contemporary of Ricci, Li Zhizao, who was writing a preface to one of Ricci's books in Chinese and took an optimistic stand, right? He said, okay, it's very interesting that that 欧洲人, right, people like Ricci, 自古不与中国相通, right? They've been separated from China for, forever. And so they don't know about Zhou Gong and Wen Wang and Kongzi and all these important cultural figures. 而特与之天, 是天, 大指乃与经传所记汝圈, right? So he says, well, the funny thing is, when they talk about knowing heaven and serving heaven, what they have to say is exactly like what we find in our classics and commentaries, right? It's like two halves of a tally that fit together. They match perfectly. And so that empowers Li Zhizao to say, 东海西海心同理同所不同者特言语文字之己, right? So this is, of course, a very beautiful vision of people agreeing, right? The mind and Li, this kind of objective, impersonal principle of logic, it's the same wherever you go. On the Eastern Sea, on the Western Sea, it's all the same. And because of that, we can trust translation. We can trust someone like Ricci, who is a mediator between the Donghai and the Xihai. The only differences are differences of words and characters, right? So that's a trivial concern. Words and characters for Li Zhizao don't really matter, because the important thing, the substance of the discussion, we can take for granted is the same. All right, terribly optimistic view. And it's no surprise that this is coming out of the pen of a Catholic convert who has been collecting the writings of different Jesuits in order to circulate them. This contrasts enormously with a book that came out about the time I was in graduate school, Jacques Gernet, Chine et Christianisme, which was translated by Janet Lloyd as China and the Christian Impact. And Gernet's thesis is that the Jesuits were doomed to fail because they were using words that that meant something different from what they wanted to make them mean, and their own concepts had no equivalent in China. So whatever translation was doing there, it was doing something rather dishonest and incoherent. And so Jeanet's book, of course, it speaks to a certain cultural and linguistic relativism, right? Which is, as always, necessary to think about. I think if we simply wanted to take the Li Zhizao attitude, we would often be disappointed. If we took the Jacques Gernet attitude, we would never be disappointed, but we would also never have the opportunity to create these new hybrid entities that happen between languages. You know, what if, so my answer to Gernet at the time and still today was, okay, what if the concepts that the Europeans and the Chinese of the 17th century were using did not correspond? What if they were kind of striving to remodel their translations and reshape their concepts in a way that would allow them to communicate, right? In other words, can't translation alter the substance of the A and B that we're talking about, right? Of the two poles of the translation. In other words, can't we have some interaction and some hybridity to make the whole business less frustrating, right? Less futile. All right. So that's what I'm insisting on with the reference to Wittgenstein and life in translation. I want to think about what happens when we consider Ricci's translation as intentional ambiguity, as a kind of an allegory in which you say one thing and you mean another. He's doing something that is extremely selective and strategic. He's performing a kind of translation of European concepts and doctrines and texts that is intended to secure acceptance from the Chinese side. And there is something a little bit suspicious about it, right? I often feel that Ricci is presenting the candidates for conversion with a kind of a document where there's a first paragraph that sounds really, really good. And then there's a lot of incomprehensible small print that goes on for hundreds of pages. And he wants you to sign on the first page and accept all the other stuff. Again, maybe he thought that sort of operation was justified. Did he think that it was a preliminary and that one day all the differences would be sorted out? Or did he just want to save souls and he didn't care about truthfulness? I don't know. But his way of approaching the Chinese by speaking their language, not just in terms of words, but in terms of concepts and overall philosophical orientation, that strategy, other missionaries then came to refuse. And there was one fellow named Longobardi who was contemporary with Ricci. While Ricci was alive, he wrote stuff that was very similar to Ricci, admiring China and saying these people are, they're just the best. They have the best governed country in the world. They have the best morals. They have, the most sophisticated theology, except for a couple of things that we can supply, right? So writing exactly like Ricci. But later on in life, I don't know what happened to make him so bitter, but he apparently must have undergone some kind of experience that made him distrust the language of the Chinese. And so he writes a little text refusing Ricci's strategy of assimilation that was seen as so scandalous that it was apparently suppressed for about 100 years. It was first published in 1701. when there was once again a controversy about the Chinese rights. I think everybody knows a little bit about this controversy. And in his polemic, he says, the Chinese language has words only for material things. When they say tian, they don't mean heaven as a kind of a divine principle that is conscious and that rewards good and punishes evil. When they say tian, they simply mean the sky. And so everything is based on a misunderstanding, he says. When the Chinese seem to talk about moral and theological issues, they're actually faking it, but they don't know this. And he calls them apes of the truth. We might say robots of the truth, right? For Longobardi, it's like having a love affair with an AI robot, right? The AI says, I love you because it's been programmed to do that, but it's inherently not capable of feeling love. Well, in that way, when the Chinese say, we worship God, they don't know what worship means. They think it just means lighting incense. And when they say God, they mean the sky. So Longobardi says, we can't use the Chinese language to talk about Christianity. We have to stick to Latin. And his proposal for saying the Mass in Chinese was to transliterate everything from Latin. So rather than saying words that make sense to the audience, people would go in and where the priest in Latin says "Sursum corda," lift up your hearts. The priest in China would say "Susun corda" or something like that, right? Making no sense at all, right? A little bit like the practice of Buddhist chanting, where people are repeating syllables that come from Sanskrit or Pali that don't really make sense, right? That would be a funny consequence of Longobardi's proposed reform. Anyway, so Niccolo Longobardi, then, he has no charity at all towards Chinese speakers. He thinks that there is no way to convert such a person unless you suppress their original language and replace it with a better language, a superior language that acknowledges spiritual realities that are separate from matter. Well, his book, then published in 1701 in Paris, in the middle of the controversy, gets read by Leibniz, who is a very different kind of thinker. And Leibniz says, well, this is funny. When I read Chinese philosophy, it all makes sense to me. And if you're having a problem with the words, maybe you should look more carefully at the European words, because the European words that you think are spiritual in nature actually all have a material meaning. You're talking about spirit. Well, the word for that in Greek is pneuma, and pneuma means nothing other than air. So his consideration of the Chinese language and of this polemic around the meanings of Chinese terms leads him back to European language, right? Chinese has an effect on the way that a speaker of European languages thinks about his own languages without necessarily knowing Chinese, but simply by being acquainted with the Chinese language and thought. So I take some lessons from this. One is, don't be Longobardi. Extend charity, Ren, to your interlocutor. Don't reduce people to being robots, right? The references of words are always primarily material and mechanical if you observe them from the outside. But if you grant others interiority, that is mind and maybe a soul, that's a hypothesis that you have to make in order to have a meaningful discussion with them. But it's not something we observe, right? I can never observe your mind or soul. I can observe your behavior, which leads me to suppose that you have an inner life. And actually, if you think about it, I'm just continuing Leibniz's thought pattern here, we don't really observe ourselves having an inner life either. We observe ourselves going through the motions of an inner life, and we interpret this as being the truth about ourselves. So let's come down, because I've already used up 45 minutes, let's come down to why this matters. It's not just remote intellectual history. It's not something that will interest only Catholics or historians of theology or historians of semantics. Ricci and Longobardi and Leibniz, this conversation stretching over hundreds of years, to which I want to add also Wang Yangming and Spinoza and Li Zhi as other participants in this conversation. Right? Not all the participants know of each other, but that doesn't matter. This case is a perfect instance of cultural contact leading to hybridity, to the imperfect matching and inextricable mingling of two systems of thought, which thereafter begin to break down as systems, right? The coherence, the self-standing nature of each system begins to break down. They become porous and vulnerable to one another, which is a good thing, I think. That mingling is what I'm calling translation as a way of life. In literature, we know that translation constantly has an effect on new writing. There's often a critique of that. People read translated books and say, oh, this is not pure English. This is not pure Chinese. This is Chinese or English that has been polluted, adulterated by the other language. I have some quotations about that from Dr. Johnson and other people, but I'll skip over them. There is, on the other hand, a school of thought that says that translation that reads stiffly, right, yin yi, as Lu Xun said, is a good thing because it announces that it's bringing things from outside. It lets you see its foreignness. I'm on board with that theory, although I also want to insist that if we talk about foreignizing translation in a puristic spirit, if the foreignness becomes a kind of an essence that we're judging translation by, then that too falls back into a kind of a polar essentialist mode of thought. So I want to make room for the plurality and hybridity that are intrinsic to translating. About the practice of translation in China studies, I've been thinking lately about David Hawkes. My friend Fan Shengyu has published a very beautiful book about David Hawkes as translator. And one of the things that he makes me notice is how experimental and impure Hawkes's translation style is. He doesn't just translate Hong Lo Meng sentence by sentence, but he rewrites it as if it had been written by a 19th century British novelist, which is, of course, contrary to fact, and in many ways doesn't accurately represent the book that we know as Hong Lo Meng, but is a very ingenious way of finding new readers for the book. And we could make it something controversial. We could say this is an illegitimate appropriation of something that is, purely 18th century, purely Manchu Chinese, or we could open the door to this kind of hybrid experimentation that I think that Hawkes is doing. So if we think of sinology as a hybrid discourse and not a colonial one, I think it changes its aspect quite thoroughly. There is a lot of colonial sinology, of course, but those people are usually not convincing. They don't translate with sympathy, and they don't let themselves be changed by the things they are reading and translating. They have not learned anything. They've only confirmed their pre-existing prejudices. So that kind of scholarship and translation, I'm very happy to downgrade. Learning about China, causes a person like me to question their inherited frameworks. And the availability of different frameworks also makes it possible for Chinese people to dissent from tradition and authority in new ways, right? The people who read Ricci and did things with his thinking that nobody was expecting, least of all the missionaries, those are very many. Without hybridity, identity becomes a kind of a sterile repetition of the same. And that, I think we can all agree, is not what we want in the world of transnational and situated knowledge. So there we are. Okay, I went a little bit over my 45 minutes. I apologize for that. And I'd love to entertain some questions if there are.
Thank you so much, Professor Saussy. That's such a rich lecture. And again, I think it shares a lot of similarities, at least in spirit and in this emphasis on the creativity, but also hybridity and transformative power of translation and life in translational practices. So it shares a lot of the similarities with the article you just published that I just read in PMLA called Translating Translations as One Does. I really recommend it to everyone. So I guess I will leave some time for some of the audiences to come up with their questions and just take the privilege of the host to ask you some questions I have. So I think I have maybe two questions broadly conceived. So the first one is more about the discipline of sinology. So I wonder whether you can say more a little bit about the differences between sinology and China studies, and then how do we translate them into Chinese, right? So there's been a lot of debate about Hanxue, Guoxue, Zhongguoxue, this kind of terms. It's all mixed up, and I wonder, what do you think about the state of discipline of sinology? For example, I think you must know that in Australia and New Zealand, under the leadership of Jeremy Barmay, they're trying to come up with this new thing called New Sinology, and it's a more holistic approach to China studies that brings together classical Chinese study with contemporary concerns for international politics, for example. So it's a more kind of practical sinology, but also grounded in the humanistic spirit. What do you think of that, right? And what do you think of our role as a comparative literature scholar can do in this? Because you are very famous for your State of Discipline book around 10 years ago on the role of comparative literature in the age of globalization, right? So I feel like there's something that is sitting in between all these debates, and maybe you can clarify or enlighten us about your thinking, in terms of your thinking on all these questions. And then the second one is a more specific one. So I've been thinking about the role of translation as well. And of course, in academia, especially in the humanities, as we do translation studies, from a more culturalist perspective or comparative perspective, we always tend to emphasize the creativity, or the hybrid power, the transformative power, the kind of going in between status of translation, right? But outside academia, as you know, in the so-called profession of translation, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on qualification, justification, right? And when they say, oh, you should be the translator of some language to another language, A to B, the standard practice is that you still have to be the native speaker of the destination language. And this seems to be quite counterintuitive to the general progressive trend to say that we should not be grounded in our kind of identity that is just that we are born into. For example, just because I'm a Chinese native speaker of Chinese, that I can only translate things into Chinese. If I, for example, master English to such a degree that I am confident to translate something into English, right? Why can't I do that? But most publishers would reject this kind of translator, right? So I just feel like between the professional conception of translation and our academic conception of translation in the broader culturalist term, there's still this gap. And I just find it quite hard to address, right? I just found whether maybe, but I see a lot of potential in your arguments that, throughout history, actually before the modern period where we categorize everything into, okay, this profession, that profession, people were much more flexible in terms of transferring their knowledge between systems. And I see a lot of potential in how we can utilize this historical tradition to transform the way we run the professions. And I just wonder whether you have observed something like that in a more kind of modern period, maybe, or do you remain pessimistic as I was in terms of how receptive they could be, the profession could be towards this conceptualization or reconceptualization of translation, more broadly speaking? Yeah, just these two questions as starting points for some discussion.
Yeah, so if I wanted to give a definition of sinology that would be rather bland and thin, but I think uncontroversial, I would just say that it's a branch of philology, right? Philology, the study of texts and languages, and so sinology is what you do when you're reading texts from the massive tradition of things written in Chinese. China studies, I think, is broader, right? And when you say China studies, the implications in English tend to tilt more toward the contemporary. If there's a question about climate change in China, for example, they're going to Google people who are in China studies and not people who are in sinology. Although I happen to have some nice Qing Dynasty texts that do talk about climate change. However, no one is going to ask me, the sinologist, to do that. So, but also China studies is broader. If you do Han Dynasty text studies, you could still be said to be in China studies, right? But I'm not sure if someone interested in contemporary politics would usually be described as doing sinology. And of course, to do a lot of contemporary stuff, you don't have to be very much engaged with the language. Sometimes, in fact, this becomes totally absurd. Well, this is really about journalism, but it's so typical. Back in the early 1980s, the New York Times sent somebody out to China to write about rural reform, right? Because people, the Gongsha were being broken up, and people were allowed to have their own plots of land and so on. And so the New York Times journalist interviewed a farmer out in Hunan or somewhere and said, "What do you think about this?" And so gave some opinions. And the New York Times reporter said in the article, the farmer, whose name was Lao Bai Xing, said blah 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 blah. And I said, "Oh my God, I can tell what happened here, right?" This reporter, who might know a little bit of Chinese, goes out to the country and gets an opinion from somebody and says, "Ni shi shui," right? Who are you? Thinking that he's going to get the person's answer, "My name is blah, blah, blah." But the hearer hears that sentence and thinks, "On what authority are you telling me this, right? What is your social role?" And the guy says, "我就是老百姓." The fellow says, "Okay, Mr. Lao, thank you very much, Mr. Lao. May I call you Bai Xing?" So anyway, that kind of thing, I'm afraid, happens a lot in the realm of China studies, where people are not engaging with the language. Because, as we all know, the Chinese language is complex and tricky, and culture is absolutely at the surface of every word that people speak. So, anyway, so there's my little story about why sinology needs to survive, even though China studies is important too. About translation, yeah, there's a sense among non-professional people that unless you're a native speaker of something, you're not an authentic speaker. I think authenticity does a great deal of mischief, honestly, in the world, because it is used sometimes to elevate a voice, right? Maybe there are, say, minority people who have never had an opportunity to speak for themselves. There, to listen to them and say, "Okay, look, this is what the Nambiquara of northwestern Brazil have to say, and we need to listen to them." Their authenticity is being used in what I would say a constructive way, but authenticity can also be used to suppress and repress, as when somebody says, I am more authentically whatever than you are, right? You think you're speaking for people of such and such a description. I am more of that than you are. And that's always a very conservative move, right? It involves assertion of authority and totality and other things that I don't like. So I think the kinds of translation that dare to be inauthentic have a lot to teach us, because those are the ones where some experiment and novelty can happen. And that's also where people have to be creative. Bad translations are typically translations that resemble what people want to hear in the target language, and they're boring because you could do it without knowing anything about the other language. But so this question of qualification definitely has to be taken with a grain of salt. One other example would be Ezra Pound's translations, which are totally inauthentic, right? When he did the translations in Cathay, he didn't know anything about Chinese. He was really just copying from the notes of someone else who didn't know Chinese either, but had friends who helped him translate. And yet they created a kind of a relationship between English language poetry and Chinese poetry that hadn't existed before. So there, I think we sacrifice some authenticity. They're not scholarly translations, but something unpredictable and wonderful happened. So you have to be open to that, I think. How is that as an answer for your question? Oh, I'm picking up on something in the chat. Identity.
Yes, I will ask them to unmute themselves and ask them. Yeah.
Please.
So you don't have to read the long questions too much. They can explain their context. But yeah, thank you for that answer. I think it's so interesting. And also the anecdotes you tell, they are so interesting. Oh my gosh. Yes.
If you ever find Mr. Lao Bai Xing, please tell him hi from me.
Yes. So next up we have Ms. Yang Weiyu from our university. I'm not sure which department. You can introduce yourself, and there's a question about identity and relation. So please unmute yourself and ask the question yourself.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Of course.
Okay. Good evening, Professor. I'm a student. I'm a graduate student from Japanese major, and I may not be able to ask some professional questions. It's just some of my experience. I can completely relate to your speech, like when you talk about the imperfect translation, and I can't help but recall the idealism, which is different in the Chinese text and the Western text. Well, in Chinese, especially in Wang Yangming's and in his thoughts, idealism, when we were talking about seeing the heart, we were talking about the real heart. And in the Western context, it's usually referred to the ration, the reason, the high knowledge, well, something like that. And also I can, because I'm learning Japanese and also English, I can feel myself transferring different egos in this when I change languages. So I can understand when you say you are more active when you're speaking Italian. Yes, because Italian is that sort of language. And about
for one thing, I make a lot of more gestures.
Yes, you have to move when you speak Italian. Sure. And also about the question, about this translation, because recently one of the my lessons teachers asked us to read about a text about Casanova, and she talks about the translation as literalism in the comparative literature. So I'd really like to ask you why you chose the identity and relation as the two indexes to represent this function of translation. Yes.
Yeah. So identity would have to do with authenticity, right? People have a criterion and they might have some ideal picture of what, proper Chinese philosophy is supposed to be, right? And so those concepts would then become a way of judging a translation or correcting an existing translation. But that can sometimes be a very puristic thing to do, right? As when people say, this is hybrid, I'm not having any of it. On the other hand, a translation always creates a kind of relation. Even if it's a terrible translation, it at least addresses somebody and tries to make a conversation happen. And so there are cases where the relationship is more important than the accuracy. Right? I was just thinking of Ezra Pound's use of Chinese in Anglo-American poetry is one example, right, where he's using it to destroy an existing tradition, and he can do that only by starting out from a point of view that is so different from the kind of verse that people were writing in the late Victorian era. Right? If you compare, if you just go back to poetry magazines of 1915 and see what people were writing, and then contrast Pound's Cathay, you can see what's going on, right? And suddenly everybody wants to write like the Tang Dynasty Chinese. It's an astonishing transformation. And so there must have been a need, and the relation comes and supplies that need, and then new things happen. So the philologists looked at Pound's Cathay and said, oh no, this is wrong. This is totally wrong. He mixes up two poems, he gets the meaning of this word wrong and so forth. But that doesn't really matter so much as what it made happen. So I guess, okay, if we want to think of identity, at that end of the spectrum as having to do with authenticity, then on the other end, where we're talking about relation, I would say effectiveness is the upshot, right? What does it make happen? Because translation is, after all, an act in the world. So I guess that's how I would make those things connect. Thank you for the good question.
Thank you, Professor. So we have several students from my class who are eager to ask questions now. So they're taking the Critical Introduction to Sinology and China Studies class. So next up we have Caitlin. Are you ready, Kate?
I am ready. Sorry, I thought I could start the video myself, but it's fine. Hi, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. I think it's really interesting, this kind of like the previous student was also saying, the unpredictability of translation, when done by humans, like as a fundamental human kind of thing, you never know what's going to happen, and there's always the potential for fallacy and stuff like this. So I'm going to read my question, if that's okay, because I won't remember it because it's so long. But on a tangent from like the 17th century Chinese sinology, on the topic of translation in a society increasingly inundated with technology that is able to do this task of translation much faster than the human analog method of learning a language and then translating it afterwards. How do you think this will affect academic studies broadly, but also Scientology specifically? Sinology specifically.
Please,
for example, like obviously we're still talking about Matteo Ricci hundreds of years after he was in China, but do you think he's important solely because he was one of the first Europeans to do such work? Or rather, do you think the continued study of this person is representative of the importance of translation studies for human society in a way that defies any technological advancement?
Yeah, very interesting question. Yeah, we are seeing the development of computerized algorithmic translation devices, and people are quite bewitched by them. The utility of these things I can't deny, but the one question for me is, what's the role of human beings in this? shouldn't there be a human speaker looking in on the translations and checking to see what they say and imply? So I'm afraid that's a little bit old-fashioned, as if the humans are supposed to set the standards and not let the machines run wild. And of course, I hate to think that I'm training all these young people who will go out in the world and have no jobs because there are computers who do everything faster and cheaper. So I am instinctively resistant to the idea that the computers will replace them. And this is something I worry about quite a lot, of course.
I try to be as optimistic as you, but I'm not sure.
Well, we may get to the point where we start smashing the machines. Who knows? It didn't work out very well for the 19th century Luddites, but then, maybe that will be the way we go. But coming back to it, though, one reason that someone like Ricci matters is that he created a lot of the equivalences that become just taken for granted. One case that will, I think, sort of carry the point. When we talk about saints, right, Catholic saints in Chinese, we use the word sheng, right? Sheng Bida, for example, right? Saint Peter, Sheng Baoluo, Saint Paul, and so on. Why is sheng the word we use for these individuals? Because if you're reading around in 17th century Chinese, the major context in which people use sheng is in things relating to imperial power, right, or otherwise cultural power, but significantly it's political power, right? The shengzhi is the edict that comes down on high from the emperor, right? So what is Ricci doing when he devises sheng as the word to be used for saints and so on? In some way, he's trying to appropriate the glamour of imperial power for the significant figures in the history of Christianity. And, but you don't notice it if it's just a word that you've grown up with and, every day you walk past the Shengbi de Jiaotang or whatever, right? It becomes just part of your reality. And I think any computer that's given the word saint will spit out sheng as the equivalent. But knowing why somebody strategically and possibly creatively or deceptively appropriated sheng as the word for those people, that's the kind of thing that so far, at least, the computers are not good at doing. So reflecting on terms and rhetoric and so on, that's what I hope there will still be room to do. Does that make sense, right?
It does. And I think it's also in terms of, like you were saying about, well, the optimism of like, we still need humans to do these jobs. Obviously, when you use translation apps, there are always mistakes, which is, like you said, with the specific words, we're not at a stage yet when the technology can replace the people. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Knock on wood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Next we have Maria. Maria, ready?
Yes. Hi. So, well, first, thank you for the lecture, and also if you can tell me if you can hear me.
Thank you. I can hear you very well.
Oh, okay. So my question was more specific about translation, because so I did my undergrad on translation, and we've always had this debate on whether we should add like translators notes and like more historical or like more background into this story. So my question was, if you think when you're doing a Chinese into other language translation, if we should add more of a historical or philosophical or any type of context that we think the reader might need to understand the text, and also if we should only do that on texts that are more like specific for the for sinologists or just to be studied, but or also add them to like novels and like short stories, because there's a lot of people that think if you add them to a novel, you're just kind of like breaking the flow and not letting the reader enjoy the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question of technique. I think in some situations a lot of footnotes are helpful. But the ideal would be if you could somehow translate in a way that would suggest what's going on without having to add a comment, right?
Yeah.
And so Hawkes is very good at this. Just to go back to David Hawkes, simply because I'm thinking about him. I'm also teaching Hong Lao this quarter, so I'm thinking about that book a lot too. And the way that Hong Lao is woven of many, many different kinds of language, right? You've got monks who speak a kind of a monkish language. You have doctors who speak doctor language, officials and tradespeople and servants, and every person kind of has their own language that's characteristic of their background and what they're thinking about. And so Hawkes reaches into the whole history of the English novel to find languages that somewhat correspond to those languages in the original, and he does it in an extremely ingenious way. And so in that way you can suggest something without having to footnote. When Cao Xueqin is making puns that sort of point to a different meaning from the obvious meaning, right? Like when he says in chapter 1 that the Zhen Shiyin and his family live in Shili Xiang, right? Shili is in 10 miles, but the 19th century commentators say, by this is meant Shili, right? Practical and advantageous, right? That is kind of a critique of contemporary society as being full of selfish people. Hawkes doesn't bother putting in a footnote, but he simply says they lived in a street called Worldly Way. So it's a very good choice because it has an echo of old-fashioned English allegorical writing like Pilgrim's Progress, right? Where the people and the places all have these very meaningful names that refer to moral categories and so on. So it took him only 2 words to kind of sketch out that background, and the job is done. So there's an instance anyway. If you can do it unobtrusively, I think that counts as genius in translation. But if you can't think of a way to do that, happens probably a lot, then the footnote becomes necessary. And I guess the footnote is a symptom of what I'm calling halfway translation. Somebody else might come along and do it better later on.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you for that great example from Hong Lao. That's really interesting. I think we have time for one final question. And Amalia, do you want to ask the question?
Sure, thank you. Can you guys hear my voice?
Yes, indeed.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed that. I have 2 questions specifically. The first question is, considering the power imbalances of the time, how did language choices and translation practices by early European scholars in China contribute to the construction of a Eurocentric perspective on Chinese culture and identity? So what are the implications of this modern cross-cultural studies? And then my second question is that, given the historical context, were there instances where language served as a tool of colonial control or cultural appropriation in European scholarship on China? And how do we navigate and address this power dynamics when we're studying in this period? Yeah,
sure.
That's a long question. Oh my God.
Okay, sure. Well, to take your question from the end and work back to the beginning, there is a lot of colonial scholarship. You can find it in old journals, and it's recognizable quite quickly because the authors had this dismissive idea, this dismissive attitude about Chinese people. Of course, they're wrong about everything because they're stupid or they're limited or they're just unfortunate in some other way. And, you can just tell that the scholar is not taking the others seriously as human beings. So for me, you know, I can smell it from 10 miles away, and I tend to avoid that kind of scholarship. So simply avoiding it, or maybe calling it out, as I often do. You know, if I'm writing about some author who has undergone this kind of treatment, this patronizing treatment, then I will say, you know, this is not really how it's done, people. Also, well, I guess primarily just the sense that, you know, the people one is translating and studying are, you know, they are fully equipped human beings. They have the whole range of mental and emotional and moral capacities. You just have to take that for granted. There's also, you know, a kind of writing about China that is friendly but patronizing. Here, this is written often by people who think of themselves as being very, you know, great friends of the Chinese, but the Chinese are, in these constructions, they are lucky because they are poor but simple. You know, no, come on. You know, China was an enormous empire when all of the countries that Europeans come from were tiny little principalities where nobody ever took a bath. You know, there's this kind of noble savage attitude is absolutely out of place. You find that less in the scholarship and more in the translation. I have an absolutely hilarious example in my blog that I put up recently. An example, by the way, from the 1940s by a translator who was active then and who published a very well-regarded anthology of Chinese poetry. But it's just, you know, just makes you sick to read it. So if you're curious, you might go to printculture.com and see this translation by this fellow. Anyway, so you always have to have a sense of why the translator or the scholar is engaging with this material, and, you know, where their personality comes out. In other words, you know, you never take scholarship just as a fact, as a given, right? It's always got to be in the debate somehow. Power relations, that's a very interesting situation, because, of course, up until the Opium Wars, nothing that Europeans did or thought about China had much effect in China, really. That I see as kind of the watershed that forces Chinese to think differently about those weird foreigners from far away. And, you know, sadly, the Qing dynasty was just not up to the task of modernizing itself. And maybe, you know, maybe there was a problem that they didn't have the thorough support of the population, because they were, after all, an occupation dynasty, right? When we talk about colonialism, we can't forget that colonial relationships happen within Asia and among Asian people, as well as between Asians and Europeans, right? I mean, it's just a dynamic that is all over the place. So, you know, the Qing had to deal with a lot of unrest on their own territory, and they probably couldn't cope with these foreigners that they didn't understand well. And intellectual people were coming up with their own kinds of response that are, you know, very sophisticated, and which also the outsiders couldn't understand very well. If you read the way that the contemporaries of Kang Youwei, for example, talk about his thinking, he is miles ahead of them as a historical thinker, and they don't understand this. So yeah, there's a certain kind of reparation work to be done when we read old scholarship. And the good stuff is out there, but you have to know how to look for it, right? And also the good stuff is sometimes not recognized by our contemporaries, you know, or we feel conflicted about it in certain ways. I mean, I'll just give a very simple example. You know, Pearl Buck, right? Bao Zhenzhu. You know, definitely somebody who loved China, who gave her life to talking about China and helping people understand China, but her ways of doing it and her reasons are, in some ways not available for us now, right? So we have to kind of read her with a feeling of, yes, but, right? It's not quite that. That's not how I interact with this culture. And yet, it's worth knowing about. Many cases like that, where at least I have a kind of divided reaction and so I try to pick out the diamonds and let the mud stay where it is.
Okay, thank you so much. I love the response.
Thank you so much for that question and that answer. I think it really clarifies things about, again, the struggle I talked about at the beginning of the talk. This effort to balance between the Orientalistic aspect, but also the positive aspects of the sinological tradition. And the act of translation, or the importance of translation, really makes it kind of the benchmark we can use to judge, because whether these scholars or this cultural exchange people involved in cultural exchange are allowing themselves to be transformed to that degree by translation, to live a life in translation. I think we can use that as some kind of benchmark to judge to judge this question, I guess. But yeah, it's a first step. Thank you so much, Professor Saussy, for delivering this talk. And I have shared the link of the print culture blog to the audiences, and I will circulate it again in my class. It's a really useful resource hub for all of us interested in questions related to sinology, translation, comparative literature. So yeah, please have a look at it. And I hope we can continue this discussion somewhere online by the venue of the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Maybe they can host another similar event. We can continue the conversation by focusing on another similar topic, related topic. But we would warmly welcome Professor Haun Saussy to come back to China sometime and to visit Shanghai Jiao Tong University in person, and we can show you around and we can continue the conversation offline as well. So thank you everyone for coming. Just an announcement about the next event. So in September, we're gonna have Professor Chris Berry from King's College London to talk about film studies. So the specific topic is North Korean films in China after the establishment of PRC. So it's a very interesting topic, and please look at our Facebook page, our WeChat public accounts for further information. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and have a nice evening or nice morning. Thank you so much, Professor, for getting up so early to deliver this talk. Yes,
happy to do it.
Yeah, we will keep in touch via email. Thank you so much.
Indeed. All right. Thank you.